हेलो दोस्तों एंड स्वागत है आपका स्लीपी क्लासेस में। आज के इस बहुत ही इम्पॉर्टेंट लेक्चर की तरफ बढ़ने से पहले जहाँ पे हम आपको दिखाएंगे कि एक जो कि थोड़ा सा कंफ्यूजिंग क्वेश्चन आया था बिकॉज कुछ बच्चों को पता नहीं था इस मूवमेंट के बारे में किस तरह से आपने अप्रोच करना था। एंड हमने ऑलरेडी जो है वो अपने एक लार्जर विमेंस मूवमेंट के क्वेश्चन के अंदर जो है उसे कराया हुआ था। राइट नाउ बिफोर वी मूव अहेड टू लेट यू नो that even though batch 6 was supposed to be our last batch but popular demand के कारण हमारा अब आखिरी बैच लॉन्च हो रहा है। राइट 10th अक्टूबर से ये लॉन्च हो गया है एंड आज राइट 11 12 एंड 13 को आपको दशहरे के मौके पे डिस्काउंट मिल रहा है 20% का बाय यूजिंग द कोड विक्ट्री। तो ये जो दिए गए प्राइसेस हैं इन पे फर्दर 20% ऑफ जो है आपको मिलेगा। राइट तो आप उसे अवेल कर सकते हैं, इस अपॉर्चुनिटी को ना जाने दें। वेरी इंपॉर्टेंटली क्योंकि आखिरी बैच है एंड लिमिटेड टाइम जो है बचा है, तो हम क्या करेंगे कि इसके अंदर आपकी 21 अक्टूबर से जो है लेक्चर शुरू होंगे जो कि आपके ओरिएंटेशन लेक्चर्स होंगे। ठीक है, और इन ओरिएंटेशन लेक्चर्स ये जो हैं ये 28 अक्टूबर तक चलेंगे। 28 अक्टूबर से आपके लेक्चर शुरू होंगे, तो इस दिन पेपर 1 के जो हैं सारे लेक्चर्स ड्रॉप कर दिए जाएंगे ताकि वो आप थोड़े इंक्रीज्ड पेस पे कर पाए। राइट बिकॉज अब उतना टाइम नहीं बचा है तो आपकी पेस इंक्रीज करने के लिए। एंड देन 1 दिसंबर को पेपर 2 के जो लेक्चर्स हैं उन्हें ड्रॉप कर दिया जाएगा। Now, very importantly, डिपेंडिंग ऑन आपकी क्या रिक्वायरमेंट्स है, वेदर आप, क्योंकि हमारे जो कोर्सेज होते हैं बहुत कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव होते हैं, ना ही इनमें कंटेंट लेक्चर्स होते हैं, करंट अफेयर्स के मंथली लेक्चर्स होते हैं, बल्कि इनमें वीकली आंसर राइटिंग प्रैक्टिस, हाफ लेंथ टेस्ट, फुल लेंथ टेस्ट, मॉडल आंसर सब कुछ होता है। तो अगर तो आप इन टेस्ट को नहीं चेक कराना चाहते, खुद सेल्फ चेक करना चाहते हैं, तो आप विदाउट इवैल्यूएशन ले सकते हैं। अगर आप इन्हें हमसे चेक करवाना चाहते हैं, फीडबैक चाहते हैं फॉर इम्प्रूवमेंट, तो आप हमारा विद इवैल्यूएशन कोर्स ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं। एंड वेरी इंपॉर्टेंटली, अपार्ट फ्रॉम अ प्राइवेट टेलीग्राम ग्रुप फॉर डाउट्स, academic mentorship under me and an academic mentor, प्लस आप इसके साथ एक यूपीएससी के सिलेक्टेड कैंडिडेट से राइट उनसे भी टेलीफोनिक मेंटरशिप चाहते हैं, तो आप हमारा विद मेंटरशिप बैच जो है उसको ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं। राइट और डिटेल्स के लिए यू कैन गेट इन टच विद आवर टीम एट द गिवन नंबर और यू कैन विजिट आवर वेबसाइट। ठीक है, तो चलिए यही चीज मैं आपको बताना चाहती थी और आगे बढ़ते हैं आज की लेक्चर की तरफ।
Now, this question says examine the scope and limitations of the women's movement in India. So, now these are two things which have been focused upon. First is the scope, and next is the limitations of the women's movement in India. Now, very importantly, the issues of patriarchal norms and how they have a wide impact, right, on the working of the state, on the conceiving of laws, on the working of the civil society, in the private sphere. All of this has been seen since long, right? In fact, when we look at the development and the scope of women's movement, we will see the scope has changed over time as well, right? There has been some continuity, but there has been the broadening and both narrowing of scope, right? So when we look at the timeline, we can talk about, say, the first phase, which occurs pre-independence scenario, right, and extends till, say, around the 1950s, right, right after independence and the coming in of the constitutional in the coming in the enforcement of constitution as well, right. Then the second phase starts mainly from the 1960s and 1970s, wherein the scope of the women's movement intersects with a number of other issues. Right? So while there were women's issues, while there was women's movements, there was also widespread interaction with social issues, with economic issues, with environmental issues. All of these were witnessed throughout the 1960s, 1970s, as well as the 1980s. Right? In the third phase of the women's movement, right, which can be seen from the late 1980s onwards, we see an increasing trend towards women realizing the autonomy of their own issues, the coming in of autonomous women's organizations also, and very importantly, the rise of middle class women's movement, right? So Gail Ombed जो है इसे highlight करती है, right? And again here a lot of attention was placed on the way in which laws were made, the internal misogyny within laws which was being experienced, and how can we rectify the same. And then 2000s onwards, we have the rise of what we call as the fourth phase of feminist movement in India, right? Which has again broadened the scope. It has brought in a lot of interlinkages with the transnational movements. It has brought in the usage of social media, which has also increased the impact of these movements multifold, right? So the scope can be seen through these timelines. Then obviously there is a need to talk about the limitations as well, the second part, right, which you cannot forget about. The limitations, what are various limitations? The problems of fragmentation, the problems of often middle class concerns or Western concerns overpowering the concerns of the more marginalized sections of the population, right? All of these need to be quoted within the limitations of the women's movement. Then again, as we've talked about, that we can't end here, right? We have to talk about a way forward, how there can be increased convergence, how there can be increased intersectionality, how there can be increased give and take across various communities, across various sections of women to further the cause of women's movement in India and genuinely add to the cause of women's empowerment, right? All of these sections need to be incorporated to answer this question well. Now, first things first, we have actually introduced the answer by talking about the first phase of the women's movement and the kind of issues that were within the scope. Now, the first phase obviously begins in the 19th century. So what we talk about as the Indian Renaissance or the social reform movement, right? Because when we look at, say, the white man's burden, the idea was that we are here on a civilizing mission. And one of the examples that they actually ended up giving to prove their civilizing mission was the condition of women in India. Right? So they said that look at the condition in women, look at the lack of rights that they have. And therefore, a major strand of the reform movement sought to empower and provide for certain rights that bettered the conditions of women in India. While at the same time, they weren't very radical, right? Because to counter the colonial movement, they also wanted to retain a certain idea of the Indian woman, the Indianness of the Indian woman, right? So they went down this middle path while trying to enforce rights for India, rights for women, right? So this was a very limited idea of women's movement, and more often than not, this was led often by male social and political reformers, right? So we had people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Jyotiba Phule, and very importantly, the woman reformer in the form of Savitri Bai Phule. Now here again, the focus was mainly on the most superficial aspects of ensuring women's rights, right? So, banning of sati, allowing for widow remarriage, increasing the marriage age as well, providing for education rights. One person who did go beyond was Jyotiba Phule and Savitri Bai Phule, because they particularly looked at the kind of discrimination that lower caste women endured and how to empower them above and beyond. Right? Over time now, because of even if we might see these as superficial reforms, they did allow for greater education opportunities. They did allow for seeping in of a greater awareness for the need of empowerment of women. And this particularly allowed an increased participation of women in the national movement as well. Right? So here the scope of women's movement became intertwined with the national cause as well. Right? And this particularly happened in the aftermath of 1919, particularly with the coming in of Gandhiji. So the kind of nationalist spiritualist movement that he conjured out of it, women became an active participant in the same, right? Because women were seen as Devi, as Shakti, right? As using their abilities for the national cause, for the larger parivar jo inka desh hai. But at the same time, we also saw the rise of certain women leaders as well, right? So say in Congress, we had women leaders like Annie Besant. We had women like Sarojini Naidu, right? We had people like Margaret Cousins. And herein starts the focus on what we say the liberal feminist women's movement, right? So we've seen, say, first generation of women's movement, right? So the kind of ideas which were espoused by scholars like J.S. Mill or Mary Wollstonecraft, right? Wherein there was a lot of faith on the state, right? That's it. When we are anti-colonialism and when we are hoping for an independent India, that this independent India, by means of various legislations and through its constitutional revolution, it will end up bettering the cause of women as well, right? So, say the formulation of the All India Women's Conference under these Congress women's leaders, wherein they ended up demanding women's suffragettes. So again, one of the core demands of the first phase of the women's movement, even in the West, right? So they said that women के voting rights जो है इनके पास होने चाहिए, and because of this, they ended up, the entire premise of petitions and prayers and pressurizing the government into accepting this. Also, very importantly, the state of Travancore happened to be one of the first states where the political rights of women were recognized, and over time they spread to other British presidencies as well, right? Eventually, these ideas of gender equality and gender justice, which had been talked of during the nationalist movement, also became a part of our constitutional edifice as well, right? So a legacy of our freedom struggle which came to be incorporated in our constitution. So when we look at articles 14 to 18, which ensure equality, prevent any sort of discrimination, allow for affirmative action for the betterment of the position of women so that they can have an equal starting ground. Similarly, when we see the prevention of exploitation and trafficking as a fundamental right, right? Again, because it is women who are often disproportionately impacted by these issues like trafficking, right? So these were all very, very important as far as the empowerment of women were concerned. Then, very importantly, to further add to this cause, when we look at Dr. Ambedkar as well, right? So again, Dr. Ambedkar and his ideas, to certain level, you can engage Dr. Ambedkar's ideas with the kind of ideas that maybe J.S. Mill was talking about as far as women were concerned, wherein legislations and activities and actions by the state was seen as one of the primary avenues of bringing about social revolution and transformation, which would ensure equality as well as justice for women as well. So in 1950s, we saw the passage of a number of legislations. So we had the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Succession Act, Dowry Prohibition Act, the Equal Remuneration Act, plus the adage in DPSPs also was hoped that it would contribute to the socio-economic and political equality and justice being imparted to the women of the country. So here again, women's movement and its scope was directed towards these legal and political expectations from the state, right? And the movements weren't very radical or didn't spill over to the civil society as such, because there was a lot of hope and expectation as far as the formal legal constitutional system, political system of India was concerned. However, over time, obviously, there were massive changes, and there was an increasing realization that while the state may have tried, when it comes to implementation, when it comes to ground reality, there was still a lot of persistence of inequalities, right? So now 1970s was also an era when on the global level also there was an increased focus on looking at women's inequality and treating it as a serious issue. Right? So in 1975, the UN was organizing women's conference in Mexico to look at these inequalities as well. And because of the same, India decided to do an in-depth study, right? To basically look at that while the constitution and the parliament had taken a host of measures to improve the status of women in India, how far were these achievements possible, right? What was the kind of on-ground transformation which was seen? And because of the same, in 1974, we had the Towards Equality report being put up also, right? In the parliament, there was widespread discussion on the same. And the report highlighted that on ground, there was persistence of inequalities, discrimination, as well as lack of opportunities as far as the Indian women were concerned, right? So there was still heightened female maternal mortality. There was still the issues of female feticide, female infanticide, which existed in the country. In terms of education and employment opportunities, also the women were suffering a lot, right? So all of this sort of it ended up, एक वो जो पर्दा फाश होता है वो हो गया कि चाहे स्टेट कर रहा हो काम, बट ऑन ग्राउंड इसका ज्यादा इम्पैक्ट जो है नहीं देखा जा रहा. And that is why we had the broadening of the women's movement and an increased engagement in the realm of the civil society. Right? So, again, one of the important movements that came about happened on the intersection of not just women's rights, but the way in which these interacted with persisting social, economic, and environmental injustices as well. Right? So, the Telangana movement was one example. Another very important example was the Chipko movement, where the primary players in this movement happen to be the illiterate Adivasi movement of this region. Right? So again, something that we've talked about, that these women wanted to ensure their rights. And particularly the main aspect, the main focus of this movement was that of the 5 Fs. Right? The issue of food, the issue of fodder, of fuel, of fiber, as well as fertilizer. Very importantly, it also marked out that how these environmental movements are intimately related to the burden upon women as providers of food as well as family. That it is up to the women to cater to the family's needs, to their food security, and often when these rights are infringed upon, the women often have to take up resistance against the state, against private organizations for the safeguarding of these rights. Similarly, a convergence with the social issues was also remarked upon by the anti-ARAC movement, जो कि आंध्र प्रदेश में हुई. Similarly, अपिको movement भी हुई थी. अपिको movement जो कि केरला के अंदर होती है, right? Which was basically talking about the ban on consumption of liquor as well, right? The sale as well as consumption of liquor. Again, why? They said this isn't just a social issue, right? Within our DPSPs also, the Gandhian DPSPs talk about the need for prohibition, right? Wherein drinking has been looked at as a social issue, as a moral issue. Right? They say that this might be a social and moral issue, but very importantly, it also infringes upon the women's rights. How? First, a number of times men end up going and spending precious incomes, right, especially from the more deprived sections of the population, in buying of liquor, right, rather than providing it for the family's well-being, they waste it on liquor. Second, very importantly, overconsumption, the problem of alcoholism, the problem of drinking was leading to increased violence, right? Both domestic violence and family violence, right? So violence against women, against wives, against children. This was becoming more and more prevalent in the family sphere, in the domestic sphere. And they said that this is intrinsically linked to social issues which are taking place in the public sphere, right? So very importantly, the public, the first connection, that how these issues in the public sphere are intimately connected to the rights in the domestic sphere of women, this was pointed out by movements such as the Apiko movement and the anti-Arak movement. Right? Now, this was obviously more elaborated upon, and as we've talked about, in early 1970s, only the kind of inequalities and the persistence of problems with respect to women's status had already been discussed in the parliament. Now, 1970s was a very tumultuous period for India, right? It was a moment of, हमने पहली बात की, poly crisis, right? Multiple crises जो है एक साथ यहाँ पे पनप रहे थे, and they were feeding into one another, including the economic crisis. And because of this reason, women's organizations became more and more prevalent, including the Shramik Mahila Sangathan. Right? And here again, they understood that economic problems, such as, say, massive inflation in essential goods, the kind of adulteration which was taking place as a result, were particularly linked to the women's causes. Again, why? The problem of family को support करना and food security ensure करना, घर का खर्चा चलाना, is often the burden of women because of the kind of patriarchal norms that exist and because of the kind of sexual division of labor that persists in the society. And therefore, when there is an excessive rise in prices of these essential goods, it is the women who have to bear the burden. उनका घर का खर्चा, उनका household expense and planning completely हिल जाता है. So these are the women who were the first to actually become aware of the kind of issues that were the kind of economic crisis which was pertaining in the society. And therefore, women ended up becoming active participants in the anti-price movement as well, across political parties lines and non-party lines as well. Right? So again, the scope of the women's movement here was very broad, and it was intersecting with social economic issues as well. From 1975 to 1985, the UN had declared this as the year of International Year of Women's Movements, and therefore autonomous women's movement in the civil society realm tended to increase as well. Very importantly, another thing that we have witnessed is 1980s again was the rise of judicial activism, right? The rise of PILs, the rise of SALs. And here again, what was witnessed was that women also ended up knocking on the doors of higher judiciary to assert their rights. One of the main incidents which happened in this regard was the Mathura rape case, right? Wherein a young tribal girl was gang raped by police officials. And what this also uncovered, right now, we see that in 1950s and 1960s, there was a lot of expectation that the state will come up with laws that will improve the cause of the women. Now, from late 1970s and late 1980s, there was an increasing realization of the patriarchal bias and misogyny which was existing within the state laws, right? So now again in the Mathura rape case, this was what was uncovered, right? That this idea of purity or certain women being moral women vis-a-vis others being looked at as immoral women, and depending on that, be having access to differential sort of rights was exposed, right? So this led to a deep-seated conversation as well, right? Similar was the issue of the two-finger test, right? This again sort of reinforced the norms of virginity, which are often associated with the purity of women, right? That women are often put forward in certain molds, and women who tend to exist beyond those molds are suddenly not ensured rights anymore. And despite repeatedly banning the two-finger test, till today, it is a massive problem which exists, which tends to harm the dignity as well as the sense of respect and security for rape victims as well. Now, because of this reason, there was women's movements and autonomous women's group who started talking about the need to reform these laws, the need to bring about reforms in personal laws as well, wherein the idea of personal is political now became of utmost importance in India, right? There was a realization that when it comes to personal laws with respect to marriage, divorce, alimony, property rights, all of these are areas where women are suffering. Then, very importantly, when it comes to customary and religious personal laws, also, various scholars put forward the ideas, right? So, including people like Flavia Agnes, including women like even Zoya Hassan, scholars like Zoya Hassan, have talked about that often group rights infringed upon the individual and personal rights of women, right? So for safeguarding the community's honor, it is often women who ended up being scapegoats. So there was a larger and widespread change demanding a transformation in these laws as well. And because of this reason, India came up with the Family Courts Act as well. There was also the passage of the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. Similarly, there was an increasing understanding of that how do we take care of this issue of feticide. And for this, very importantly, to do away with pre-birth elimination of girls, there was the passage of Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act. Similarly, women were increasingly approaching the court also. So we see the coming in of the Shah Bano judgment, very importantly, right? The Shah Bano judgment, wherein the rights of the Muslim women to maintenance in the aftermath of the divorce were asserted, and this led to the passage of the Muslim Women's Protection Act in 1986 as well. Now, since the 1990s, we have entered what is called the third phase of the women's movement. And again, because of in the prior phase, we saw the rise of the autonomous women's movement, there was an increasing orientation and participation of the middle class women as well, right? So people like Gail Ormond, people like Mary John have actually talked about the fact that how middle class women, autonomous women's group have now tended to dominate the women's movement in this scenario. And then the scope of the women's movement has also increasingly tended to move towards these issues, which impact these women as well. Now, one of the first important developments in this regard came from the judiciary, right, in the passage of the Vishakha guidelines. Now, while the starting point was with the Banwadi Devi case, it was the middle class who was approaching the courts, right? And the conception of the guidelines to prevent sexual harassment at workplace was also a result of the same. And this very importantly pressurized, therefore, legislative activity on part of the parliament also, which led eventually to the passage of the POSH Act, right? The Prevention of Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act. Then, very importantly, there was also an increasing realization of what we have already talked about, the politics of presence. Right? So the women's movement increasingly realized the importance of politics of presence. One of the reasons for the same, again, something that scholar Mary John talks about, that since the late 1980s, you had also seen the coming up of this autonomous realm of women's studies. Right? Women's studies as a completely different area of academic interest, wherein the kind of patriarchal biases, exploitation, and struggle that women tended to witness needed to be studied in its own regard. And one of the consequences of the same was the fact that political presence, political power in the hands of the women may be one of the necessary elements to bring about changes, to bring about empowerment of women as well. And one of the first ways of doing the same came through the passage in 1992 of the 73rd and the 74th Amendment Act, providing for 33% reservation for women in local self-governments. So be it Panchayati Raj institutions or be it the urban local bodies. Again, it is these ideas which have cemented the requirement of women's reservation, which has eventually led to the passage of the 106th Amendment Act, providing for reservation for women in all elected legislative bodies. So even the state assemblies as well as the parliament की लोकसभा, हर जगह as well as the parliament, हर जगह जो है आपको reservation for women जो है देखने को मिले. Now, over time, very importantly, in the 1990s, there also came to be a realization, because middle class movement, educated movement was on the rise. There was this idea by people, scholars like Gopal Guru and Sharmila Rege, that this was often leading to ignorance of the Dalit women and their struggles, which very importantly they said could not just easily be a part of the larger women's movement because of the kind of differences and double discrimination that these women tended to suffer from, right? And that is why the assertion that Dalit women, very importantly, they say, talk differently. Right? That their struggles are different, the way in which they assert their struggles, the way in which they conceptualize of these struggles are extremely different from the mainstream movement. Very importantly, 2000s onwards, we have also seen the rise of fourth phase of the women's movement, which has further expanded the scope of the women's movement with the coming in of liberalization, with the coming in of globalization, with the coming in of modern technology and digital media. Now, here, very importantly, intersections and networking and networks of women's movements, particularly the wider international NGOs working in this realm, came to be intrinsically tied to the feminist movement, to the women's movement, which was operating in India. Now, one of the first things was the backlash against forces of globalization also, right? So the kind of backlash in which the women's movement also became an important part. Why? Because this was leading to a rolling back of the state. And one of the things very important for women was also the kind of state services which were required to provide for or to reduce their family का जो burden उनके ऊपर आता था. Now, very important is also led to the rise of focus on reproductive rights plus bodily autonomy of women. And this particularly came into focus in the aftermath of the 2012 Delhi gang rape case, which led to the Nirbhaya movement. And because of the advent of social media, what happened that there was widespread global global attention as well. And subsequently, based on the recommendations of the Justice Verma Committee, India's rape laws were amended to make them more stringent. Right? There was an expansion of the definition of rape. The punishment for rape convicts was made more and more stringent. Plus, importantly, stricter punishments for other offenses, including acid attacks, stalking, and voyeurism. These were also included. Plus, this also talked of the Nirbhaya Fund to ensure security of women, plus the starting of fast-track courts to look into these incidents which had resulted in the violation of rights for women. Now, particularly, not just with respect to the gang rape and the need for security, the wider issue, the wider Pandora's box was also opened. And this was highlighted in the ethnographic work of the sociologist Shilpa Padke. Now, she says that because of this constant threat to security, to the autonomy and the bodily rights of women, what happens is that when you look at access to public spaces, when you look at freedom to movement, right, in her work, Why Loiter, she says it is often men who end up enjoying the same. Right? So you'll hardly see women alone in public places, or you'll hardly see them beyond a certain time. So what is happening that even their basic rights, the access to these public spaces, the access of freedom of movement, is being prevented because of the kind of patriarchal violence that persists in the society. Similarly, there was also interconnections with other such economic issues also, right? In 2017, again, social media became a wide platform for women to protest against 12% tax which was imposed on menstrual products. So they were saying that on one hand, you want to increase access for women, for their health, for their hygiene, for sanitation purposes to menstrual products. And on the other hand, you're also leveling such a high tax on these products as well, on products like sanitary napkins, pads, etc. And this hashtag Lahu Ka Lagan became very famous, eventually leading the government to scrap the period tax in 2018. Right? So all of these issues, all of these movements have been talked about, right? Similarly, the interconnections we can talk about of the coming in of things like slut walk, which have also led to a very polarization within the women's movement, right? Or the hashtag Me Too movement across the world again, which was a major aspect of the entire fourth phase women's movement in India as well. Now, this has also exposed the limitations in women's movement. First thing first is pointed out by Chandra Mohanty, wherein she says that within the feminist movements, there are dominant Western forms of feminism that tend to homogenize and universalize the experiences of all women. And therefore, their differences, their different concerns, their differential experiences are often not accounted for. Right? This is again a conversation that already Sharmila Rege and Gopal Guru have talked about. Similarly, Gail Ombit has also talked about the need to understand the differential experiences of Dalit women, right? And the kind of differential impact and response also that these women face, right? So, say a lot of criticism had come, say the kind of response and the widespread backlash that one had witnessed during the Nirbhaya movement against the kind of gang rape. They say a similar widespread support did not come during, say, rape cases of Kathua or, say, Hathras, right? Why? Because they say because of the varying socio-economic background of the victims here, right? So this is a great example in this regard. Then very importantly, scholars like Anupama Roy also point out that when we talk of women's movement, there is a lot of fragmentation because of the ideological diversity, and the need to build alliances can often become very difficult. This problem is also pointed out by Nandita Shah and Nandita Gandhi. Right? So again, we can talk about that how certain concerns are labeled as, say, mainly middle class concerns, or the concerns of the educated youth, something that maybe a lot of other women do not connect to. Right? So again, slut walk की जब हम बात करते हैं, इसके कारण इसे काफी criticism मिलता है. Then very importantly, say DU में we had movements like the Pinjra Tod movement, right? Which talked about that why, say, having certain timelines or deadlines for women to come into hostels wherein men did not have these was absolutely against the idea of gender equality. Now, the backlash came against this, and they said that if the hostels became so open, what is going to happen that a lot of women who end up coming from tier 2, tier 3 towns or villages to come and study, and one of the primary requirements for their parents to allow them to go and study is that there will be safety and security of their children, right, which is ensured through the rules and norms that are imposed by these hostels, right? So they say the disappearing of these rules might actually lead to an unexpected, unimagined negative consequence as far as women from deprived sections of the population are concerned. So you probably aren't taking this into consideration, right? Then, very importantly, Flavia Agnes has also pointed out other challenges, including resistance and institutional barriers. So we've witnessed that how, in terms of particularly movements by minority women, right? So Shah Bano judgment ke andar, Shaira Bano judgment, which led to the doing away of the triple talaq. Yeah, even amongst majority women, right? When we saw the Sabrimala temple entry movement, the passage, the acceptance by the five-judge constitutional bench, there is often institutional challenge and societal challenge imposed upon them. Often women themselves say standing up against it, right? So say in terms of group rights versus women's rights, there is no clarity there, right? So say, for example, with respect to the debate on hijab, while there are certain women's movements which talk for the need of UCC to ensure bodily and greater autonomy with respect to decision making, there are others who believe that the change needs to come from within, and sometimes the carrying out of these traditions can be a matter of choice for minority women, and in fact, by reclaiming them, they might assert their independence as well. Right? So this is a great challenge. Then, very importantly, institutional barrier, wherein in terms of even the body which is being provided to further the cause of women's rights, something like National Commission for Women has not ended up playing the role it was expected to play. Right? Kalpana Sharma also in her work has talked of the economic constraints that the women's movement ends up playing. However, in the longer run, there is an increased realization that if the women's movement wants to genuinely empower, wants to move towards uh, 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 reduction of discrimination and egalitarian rights, more needs to be done, right? Already we have the gender inequality index, which points out that how even after decades and decades, in terms of provision of economic and employment opportunities, in terms of ensuring educational opportunities, in terms of even ensuring political empowerment, India lags behind, right? Therefore, there is the need to focus on women's issues. Plus, within the women's movements, also there is an increasing need to build alliances. Right? This is also being seen. Say, for example, women's movement building a rainbow alliance with the LGBTQIA plus community. Similarly, scholars like Flavia Agnes have also talked about that how across caste, class, religion, right, women have tended to come together to fight for their rights. Right? This can be seen in women together approaching the 9-judge constitutional bench, which has been set up to review the Sabrimala judgment, and now again cases pertaining to other women's rights also, including Muslim women's right to enter mosques, Parsi women's right to enter fire temple after marrying a non-Parsi, as well as the practice of female genital mutilation in the Dawoodi Bohra community. All of them have been compiled. Therefore, over time, we have seen the scope of the women's movement rising. We are seeing increasing coalition building. We are also becoming more and more aware of the limitations and how to do away with the same. Right? The idea is to move ahead, to have sustained efforts to build more intersectionality, to ensure that the women's movement genuinely leads to tangible improvements, policy change, and rights for women being asserted in India. Right? So these are certain factors and examples that you can include while talking of the women's